Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Stanley Wu, and I am the coordinator for Omega and the director of the Resilience Project. This webinar is hosted by the Omega Collaborative and is co-hosted by Randy Hayes. The Collaborative is a consortium that is working on the global polycrisis and includes the Millennium Alliance for Humanity in the Biosphere at Stanford, the Kranz Foresight Analysis Nexus, or the FAN Initiative, the Resilience Project, and the New School at Commonweal. We're delighted to be joined today by Stan Cox, a leading voice in the challenges of rationing and how managing increasing demands for water, clean air, minerals, energy, and food is rapidly becoming one of the greatest challenges. This conversation will be hosted by Joan Diamond and by Michael Lerner. And now, without further ado, Joan Diamond.
Well, I'd like to welcome, first of all, the courageous few who are joining us this morning. And I use the word courageous because I think this topic is a quiet trigger for many people. For some, they just see us as being, or someone who talks about rationing, alarmist. And the goal is to, just turn away. For many others, it is too personal. It's where the collapse, the existential risks we're facing, the threats to democracy, the environmental degradation just come too close to home when we talk about rationing and our own lives. So I consider those who join us the courageous. Here we are, within a month, I think it is, of hitting 8 billion people on the planet, increasing calls for no growth, degrowth society because of the lack, being out of sync with our resources and our human needs and our human demands. The simplest equation we have out there is that of supply and demand. And what we're talking about today is those being out of balance, seriously out of balance. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Randy Hayes of the FAN, who brought Stan Cox to us today to help us, begin an approach to this very difficult topic.
One of my favorite organizations is the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, which was started back in 1976, focusing on sort of a global movement around perennial regenerative agriculture, but particularly at scale, given the amount of calories that grains represent in the 8 billion diet. So Stan Cox is at the Land Institute as a senior research fellow in their ecosphere studies program, but his background was in plant breeding at Iowa State, and he worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a wheat geneticist for 13 years. However, a couple of decades ago, he joined the Land Institute and worked for a number of years developing perennial sorghum. 2 years ago, he transitioned to his new position at the Ecosphere Studies as a research fellow and has been working on the transformation of agriculture and getting beyond capitalism's destructive growth in ways that ensure sufficiency for everyone. He, of course, has a number of technical papers in his perennial sorghum and related topics, but he's written books on diverse subjects as an odd combination from food and medical industries themselves to air conditioning, to rationing, today's subject, and to natural and / unnatural disasters. So Stan, we quite look forward to your comments today, and I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Randy, and thanks to everybody for joining us today to talk about a subject that people like to talk about or experience about as much as a tooth extraction, but it is important. Before I get into this, I first want to say I recognize that the problem as you do, that the problem we're dealing with now is not only greenhouse warming, because that same bonanza of coal, oil, and gas that has produced about 3/4 of the greenhouse emissions that now threaten humanity and the earth has also enabled the industrial world to transgress most other critical planetary boundaries: biodiversity loss, soil degradation, disruption of the Earth's nitrogen cycle, and others, as you're all aware. 2 years ago, a group of scientists published a paper in the journal Nature showing that the accumulation of human-produced mass, that is, everything we've manufactured and built and is still around, has accelerated over the past 4 decades to the point of overtaking and now surpassing the Earth's total standing biomass. The stuff we've made outweighs all of the living biomass on Earth. This growth in production obviously can't go on indefinitely. Now, if this overshoot of planetary boundaries is to be stopped and reversed, our extraction of material and energy resources, along with other forms of ecological assault, needs to be tightly restrained, and markets aren't capable of doing that. Since the 1970s, efforts to limit society's aggregate ecological footprint by encouraging lifestyle changes, voluntary restraint in consumption, et cetera, have failed over and over, and more dramatic measures are needed. There's long been an interest in carbon tax as an alternative to rationing resource use. If we were talking about this back in 1990, with half a century ahead of us in order to rein in greenhouse gas emissions, we could probably talk about carbon tax, but it's too late now. If we did want to hold global warming between below the safe limit of 1.5 degrees Celsius that IPCC estimated a few years ago, a carbon tax would need to start as high as $1,000 per ton and rise as high as $27,000 per ton by the year 2100, according to IPCC. By comparison, prices in today's carbon markets are laughably small: $6 in the European system, $3 for Japan's carbon tax, because that's all the market can bear without the economy breaking down. William Nordhaus, a pioneer of such analysis, has concluded that even modest carbon taxation would be too hard on the economy. In his words, it would be, quote, unrealistically ambitious. The economically rational climate goal he estimated that could be addressed with a carbon tax would be a cataclysmic temperature rise of 3.5 degrees Celsius. So that's the logic of economics. It's too late now to sufficiently reduce humanity's ecological footprint by focusing our policies at the point of consumption. We now have to focus at the point of extraction and production, and then adapt our consumption accordingly. That means finding a direct, secure way to limit the quantities of fuels, minerals, and biological resources we extract from the earth and use to produce material goods. I'll describe in a minute how that might work. But I want to stress here that if we did manage to reduce resource extraction and material production successfully, the first line of response to the resulting shortages would need to be allocation of resources toward production of essential goods and services. We need to steer resources toward meeting basic human needs and protecting nature, and away from production directed solely at increasing profits, which is the purpose of production today. Such policies were administered in this country by the War Production Board in the 1940s. And it's been done repeatedly in the decades since under the Korean War Defense Production Act, most recently during the current pandemic. But even with reallocation of resources, production of essential consumer goods may not be able to keep pace with unrestrained demand. In the market, that would ignite inflation. Therefore, price controls would be needed to keep goods affordable, as price controls were used in the 1970s for gasoline, heating fuels, etc. But keeping prices low would stimulate even higher demand, which it did in the 70s, pitting consumer against consumer. And those of you my age will recall the endless lines at gas stations that were emblematic of the 1970s. This is where rationing then comes in for the sake of justice and equity. The goal of rationing is too often misunderstood. And this is the most important thing about rationing. It's not a primary means of reducing consumption directly. Rather, it's an adaptation to existing shortages, whether they're externally triggered, as we've seen in pandemic time, or if they're intentional, rational policy, as I'll be describing here. They provide, in a time when shortage is a reality, they provide equity and fairness. Rationing does. Fair shares rationing of essential goods and services with price controls and income redistribution can ensure sufficient and equitable access for everyone. Because resource consumption is strongly correlated with wealth and income, the consumption ceilings imposed by rationing require the affluent to make the biggest sacrifices. And the floor that rationing puts under consumption, every household being guaranteed a sufficient quantity at an affordable price, can improve living standards for low-income households. For example, during World War II, per capita consumption of protein, calories, calcium, vitamins all increased because people who had been suffering through the Depression and couldn't afford enough quality food suddenly were guaranteed that they could get a certain amount at a reasonable price. If we leave healthcare aside, other forms of rationing have generally been tolerated or even welcomed in times of shortage. Ration subsidized food programs are highly popular in low-income countries such as Egypt and India. People usually accept and readily adapt to water rationing. Polling in the 1940s United States found strong approval for the wartime rationing program, often in the range of 2 to 1. Now, about that last figure, I'm not naive. I realize we're living in a very different time now, 80 years later, when a lot of people are going to howl if they perceive anything intruding on their freedom, quote, and politicians are afraid to even bring up subjects like this. But that's a political problem. It's not a problem of it simply not being possible to ration, because we know it's been done before many times. The empty shelf crises we've been seeing over the past 2.5 years, thanks to COVID and supply chain disruptions, has cried out for rationing, but it hasn't really been done. For a while, many stores did limit the amount of, say, toilet paper you could buy in order to prevent hoarding. But in that case, people could simply go to the next store and buy more. There's another difference between past and future rationing. I'm talking here about using it, excuse me, as an adaptation to collectively imposed limits on resource use, not on, say, in World War II with a rubber supply from Asia being cut off, but we'd be doing it by agreement ourselves. If we do that, we'll be leaving fossil fuels, timber, whatever, sitting out there easily available, but we'll refrain from extracting them, to say the least, resisting that temptation would further complicate the politics of limits. And then finally, one more difference. Allocation and rationing efforts of the past were ad hoc responses to unavoidable temporary resource scarcity. So measures were typically applied commodity by commodity as shortages or inflation affected those individual commodities. Now, with a global ecological emergency underway, excuse me. Now, with a global ecological emergency underway, we're confronted with the need to limit extraction and use of virtually all resources intentionally as a society. This is a dizzyingly complex problem, so where do we begin and with which resources? I've been arguing for some time that we start by rapidly phasing out oil, gas, and coal. Unlike other resources, fossil fuels have to be almost completely purged from our economies in the coming years if Earth is to avoid catastrophic heating from carbon pollution. And given how rapidly IPCC says we have to reduce emissions at this point, we have to snuff out the burning of fossil fuels, the beating heart of global capitalism, faster than we're able to phase in alternative energy sources to replace them. Capping and rapidly reducing fossil fuel extraction will inevitably reduce the amount of energy available to industry for production of virtually all goods. So that will mean less exploitation of mineral and biological resources, unless we really do go crazy building electric cars, and less production of plastic and other waste. It will require thoroughgoing societal adjustment, but it'll be a great relief for the Earth. Now, a fossil cap would not substitute for other conservation measures or rights of nature laws. More logging bans would be needed, for example, to prevent the increased use of wood as a substitute for coal. In my book on rationing, any way you slice it, I examined rationing of four things: energy or carbon, water, food, and medical care in the past and the present and around the world. Water rationing, almost always a local issue, would need to continue when and where it's needed. Biodiversity would continue to require protection, whether or not global warming is curbed. But to get us started at long last on the road to global ecological restraint, declining cap on fossil fuel extraction and use would be a huge first step, and it would be the biggest first step we could take. Then adaptation would have to come through planned allocation of energy resources to essential industries, along with rationing, to ensure fairness and sufficiency for households, for the energy customers. For the past couple of years, my colleague Larry Edwards and I have been proposing a policy framework we call Cap and Adapt. You'll find a link to it in the paper that you received for this webinar. Briefly, Larry's and my proposed policies would place impervious caps on the nation's total supplies of oil, natural gas, and coal. Most importantly, those caps would ratchet down quickly year by year. Would ratchet down year by year. Under federal regulation, the cooperatives would allocate their diminishing allotments of fuel to society's various sectors, giving priority, for example, to power plants that might still be needed to supplement renewable generation for a period of years, for continued development of non-fossil energy capacity, for critical consumption such as for home heating, and for uses in agriculture and essential manufacturing and transportation. Then in the consumer energy market, fair shares rationing would be needed. And in the cap and adapt idea, and also in a decade ago, a thing called tradable energy quotas that they talked about in the British Parliament and rejected as ahead of its time. And under this kind of system, each household could have an account analogous to a bank account, but not involving money. Ration credits would be deposited into the account each week or month with equal quantities per household, and then either per person or per household. And then the consumer could use a ration debit card along with a cash or regular bank debit card, primarily, and this would primarily be used when filling the gas tank or paying utility bills, but for other purchases of energy as well. Energy frugal households could either save their unused credits for future use or sell them into a ration pool from which they could be distributed equitably and free of charge to households that require additional credits. Although every community would be playing by the same overall national rules, kind of an umbrella of national policy with equal ration quotas for everyone. The system could be administered at the community level as local rationing boards did in the 1940s. Even greater local autonomy could be achieved by designating a supplemental pool of collective energy rations to be allocated by each community as a whole for the common good. As the total fuel supplies tightened under this kind of system and alternative energy systems are not managing to fill the gap, ad hoc rationing with price controls could become necessary not only for energy, but also for material goods. This would be another example of rationing in its proper role as an adaptation to agreed upon limits where it can ensure sufficiency and equity. There was much study and discussion of rationing among economists in the 1940s, and then again during the energy crisis in the 1970s. Congress even passed a standby gasoline rationing plan in 1980, but then the supplies of international supplies of oil freed up, and the standby plan was never put into effect. Of course, today, rationing is a dirty word, especially in economics. In the past year or so, however, as climate projections become more dire by the day, I've noticed increased interest in rationing among academics, scientists, the general public, and even a few public officials. The well-known NASA climate scientist and activist Peter Kalmus, for instance, is now endorsing a direct phase out of fossil fuels supported by planned allocation and rationing, and he's drawing support. He has a big following. Then at a committee hearing held last year by Ireland's top legislative body, Larry and I happened to catch the video of this. 4 prominent climate researchers responded to members' questions, members of the Irish Parliament, with blunt, urgent policy recommendations. And these were the kind of things you rarely, if ever, hear from scientists who generally are quite conservative in what they say and reluctant to speak in sweeping terms. But one of them, for example, Barry McMullen of Dublin City University, declared that it's time for, quote, politically risky leadership because, quote, the scale and urgency of our predicament requires consideration of policies outside our previously self-imposed restrictions on what is thinkable. So we need to remove the self-imposed restrictions on what we believe is possible and have self-imposed restrictions on what we consume. That wasn't what he said. That's my comment. And that, he explained, requires rationing of energy to protect fairness and justice. He said, this doesn't involve telling people how to use their rations. You leave it up to people to figure out how to best pursue their own goals. The other scientists made similar urgent appeals, and members of the committee, the politicians themselves, responded positively. Okay, finally, here for the past few minutes, I've been talking about a national fossil fuel phase out, but what would be possible globally? There's a growing movement for doing that through a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, and it has drawn broad support among academics and activists. It's a great proposal, but I'm afraid that a global treaty like that is purely aspirational in a world where nations can't agree on anything substantial. You're not going to get 160 countries to agree on anything. And that includes the 26th annual climate summit so far. And I doubt that COP27 is going to change that tradition. That said, though, I do want to mention one draft from a global organization called FASTA. It's a there's the it's just it's Irish for future or something like that, and that's their email address. They're headquartered in Ireland. It's the first proposal, unconnected to Barry McMullen, the Irish scientist. But it's the first proposal I've seen for a global declining cap on fossil fuels that I would consider potentially workable. And it would redistribute resources as a side effect, redistribute resources to low-income countries. Then each nation would need to develop its own means of adapting to the energy, dwindling quantities of fossil fuels by developing its own resource allocation and energy ration plan. So the kind of thing I was urging for the United States, each country could find its own way to do that, to adapt to the phase out of fossil fuels. But sadly, once again, back here in the real world of government and politics, prospects for pulling back within ecological limits in the near future are pretty dismal. But if we and what's left of our republic can manage to pull out of our current anti-democratic nosedive and rise to become, for the first time, a true multiracial pluralistic democracy, maybe we can find our way as a society to live humanely on much less material production and consumption. I know that's a long shot, but I think it is important for us to acknowledge the depth of the transformation that's required, even if it turns out in the end that our society is not capable of that. And this last issue, I was just discussing the relationship between climate and our anti-democratic nosedive here in the US and a number of other countries, as you know. I'm currently, since April, in a monthly series at the City Lights Books website called In Real Time. And then that's the URL, it's just bit.ly/Stan Cox. I've been examining this, both keeping up with the progress of whether we're going to turn toward true democracy or toward authoritarianism, and talking to people in the world of climate activism about and voting rights, other things, about how they are adapting and plan to adapt if the worst happens. And So I'm looking forward very much to some discussion here, because this is a subject that prompts, I think, more questions than answers when you're talking about it. So thank you again for having me come in with you.
Stan, thank you so much for a fabulous presentation, and also the extraordinary paper, which is really remarkable and very thought-provoking. We have 2 points. One is we always believe in embracing our own errors here. And one of the reasons that attendance is low was that a lot of people had trouble signing in, it turned out. And so it's, as Joan said, the brave few, but in reality, there were others who tried to sign in. Some figured out how to get in, but that's our error, and it hasn't happened before. But I'm sure there were a lot of people who wanted to be here. I'm so grateful we'll be able to post the whole thing, and it will be seen widely. So that explains in part what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there are some wonderful questions in the chat, but to me, I think a central one narrows down to this. Even assuming that at a national level, one could have a central government and a system that would allow and enable rationing for equity to take place, and even assuming that there were some authoritarian governments, such as China perhaps, that could enact and assure rationing, it seems likely that a very large part of the world would be neither able nor willing to do it. And that in a large part of the world, that it would be price rationing that would take place. So clearly you've thought about this. And I'm just curious, I think of Peter Singer at Princeton, the extraordinary ethicist who has created the website and the book, The Life You Can Save, and who argues that ethically all human lives are of equal value. And so ethically, to extend your point about equity, all human lives in all countries are of equal value. So even if one could ration equitably in the United States, if we were attempting to ration equitably around the world, the rationing would be very different. So that's a complex of questions, but I'm curious how you have thought about that.
Yes, that's one, that is the biggest problem we face. And besides, when the only thing around was this idea of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, that seemed just as unlikely to work. But this FESTA group, the way I'll try to briefly, and I may garble it a little bit, but briefly explain what they are proposing. There's actually a group of countries already called BOGA, Beyond Oil and Gas. Ireland, France, Costa Rica, there may be a half dozen countries who have a kind of a compact among them on reducing, phasing out fossil fuels in their own economies. But that's just a handful of countries. What FESTA is proposing is probably a lot of you are familiar with the concept dating back to the 1990s called contraction and convergence, where the affluent countries who have high emissions, high energy use would reduce theirs at the same time that low-income countries who probably may even have a deficiency of energy would could be able to modestly increase their emissions. So there, FASTA is proposing groups of countries like to emulate BOGA, but to reduce the fossil fuel use by selling permits for extraction and sale of fossil fuels, and to reduce the quantity year by year, and then the revenue from those sale permits would be redistributed on a per capita basis within that group of countries, and they were proposing these are just examples of matching a group of fluent countries with a group of low-income countries, and so having both types of countries in there, so that there's a very significant amount of transfer of revenue to allow, for one thing, for the low-income countries to develop some renewable energy policy and so forth. Then eventually these, what they call clubs of nations that are representative of the world as a whole with regard to income and so forth. These clubs could start interacting with other clubs or merging with other clubs, and eventually, they were showing you could probably get at least 80% of the world's fossil fuel use covered by that. Now, that's a very tall order to do that, but it's the best thing I've heard of for doing it.
But that's exclusively fossil fuel, right? And your point is that this is a much broader set of issues. So it just seems that we can really imagine it in a reasonably well-governed country with national control, and that at the international level, it becomes a whole order of magnitude more complex, and obviously so. I want to just turn to Randy Hayes, who's thought about these things, and we'll come back to that. But Randy, what are you thinking about as you listen to this?
One of the unattended arenas in social change is overconsumption reduction. The World Bank likes to think that its mission is poverty alleviation, but probably a more useful institution would be the World Bank of Overconsumption Reduction in terms of solving problems. And Stan, in your paper, it's clear that you point out how market forces can't solve this problem. It's not positioned to solve the problem, quite the opposite. And it's not commonly understood that rationing can be an overconsumption reduction process. But when you mention that the well-to-do contribute most, so to speak, or suffer harder, so to speak, and in your paper you say that there were plenty of examples where the underdeveloped, if you're malnourished or starving, you're underdeveloped. So they're not just overdeveloped situations, they're of course underdeveloped, and they often prospered in this situation. So in terms of that balancing of the scales and overconsumption reduction, I think a preponderance of humanity, if they thought of rationing in terms of overconsumption reduction, would find it a rather appealing aspect. And I just don't know if you have more to say about that aspect of it.
Yes, certainly, you're exactly right, Randy. Yeah, we've probably all seen Oxfam's plot of the human population according to wealth, and it's kind of shaped like a martini glass, where there's the very 10% or so of the world's population consuming or having almost all the wealth, and then it quickly narrows to this little stem. And that is the situation. And that would mean that the very vast majority of people in the world would benefit from this kind of contraction and convergence, not only for income and for greenhouse gas emissions, but for pretty much everything. Regarding other resources other than fossil fuels, the biggest danger there, I think, is a lot of the stuff that the rich countries are planning to do to adapt to or to try to replace fossil fuels. And I mentioned electric cars. The global quest for lithium, cobalt, and other metals that to go in the batteries of electric cars, especially, but they're also batteries for the so-called green electricity grid and all of that are is going to, it's already leading to ecological destruction and humanitarian crises, and it'll probably lead to military conflict, especially out in the Pacific, where they're planning to mine the deep ocean floor for these nodules that contain critical elements for this. It's just not, to take 250 million, a quarter billion personal vehicles in the United States and say, okay, we're just going to swap those out for a quarter billion electric vehicles and not completely change the way that we move from place to place is obviously counterproductive.
And my one-liner on transportation was simply quadruple the mass transit in every large and medium-sized city worldwide. Should be the path forward. Right. Quadrupling mass transit and lowering the price as you do it, is the kind of systemic solution in that arena that I see. Michael?
Stephen Marshall has posted a number of interesting comments and questions, and here's one of them. The injustice of the market system is that it allocates to those who have money and therefore less need, not to those who have the greatest need. The potential for rationing is to ensure that necessary goods are distributed by need, not wealth. This is the correction that I'm looking for. And it seems to me that in addition to the point about how it can seem to work nationally, how global use of rationing is much more complicated, but there are other points. So for example, one of the real possibilities all of us know is systemic collapse at a high level. And if there's systemic collapse, then there won't be the ability to ration, obviously. But what will happen potentially is that if money collapses, if everything else collapses, that barter will become a fundamental approach to this. And because in collapse, it's at least possible that a lot of the higher income countries and individuals will have a lot of lowering of income and capacity. It could result in greater equity. So it's just an interesting point, and I wonder if people have thought about it, whether collapse may be a road in a greatly reduced system to barter economies and greater equity. Stan?
Makes sense to me, and I think also the within countries, the wealthier people are as a general rule, it seems to me, the less they know about how to get by, how to be resourceful, or how to make things, or how to grow food, all those things. And so in a barter economy, the people who know how to fix plumbing or whatever are going to grow wheat are going to have the upper hand.
I think that's authentically true. Joan Diamond, have you had any reflections?
Well, I just wanted to respond to these last two comments. I think that when that discussion is presented, often the response is yes, but the question is the path from here in the collapse to the barter society, how bloody is it?
Incredibly.
And, are there ways to, so it creates this sometimes nice sort of vision of a more equitable world, but are there ways to, ameliorate or reduce that transition? Because the horrors would also then frame that new society.
Carlos Schultz from Brazil writes, market speculators being those that are not at all involved in the industry production distribution, but are only involved to profit. Absolutely, Carlos, that's so true. So Stan, as you have reflected so deeply on these issues, do you see benefit in the high-income countries that may have the capacity to do this, engaging in deep rationing on their own, even if the rest of the world isn't going to be able to do it effectively? In other words, what are the benefits in a global system that can't do this if the higher income countries, or some of them, are able to and engage in it? How does that work?
It seems to me that the high emitting countries, which almost all are also wealthy countries, it's a moral, ethical obligation to do it, even if we don't think that China or India or other countries will do it, because we have both the need, a much greater need to reduce our emissions than most other countries, and we have the capacity to do it. We have a big cushion from the wealth that we've accumulated, mostly at the expense of the rest of the world. And then we also have an obligation, and this is something that would be built into the non-proliferation treaty, to provide financial assistance to countries who can't afford to reduce their dependence on fossil fuels, to help them both with development, improved quality of life, and non-use of fossil fuels. But this sort of thing, there's this commitment that goes back to the Paris Agreement, I guess, that the rich countries are supposed to give 100 billion a year, or put that into a fund for green energy development in the rest of the world, and haven't been doing it all this time. And I've been arguing recently that our country could cover the whole thing, the whole 100 billion, with just 1/10 of what we spend on the military, and that's our priorities are so upside down.
Mm-hmm. Randy, I've always loved your phrase. It's kind of a model for me. Sometimes I garble it. but your vision of continental networks of bioregional economies. That's been your vision for some time. How do you square continental networks of bioregional economies with Stan's proposal for rationing? How does it fit in your view?
Well, I haven't put serious thought into that aspect of it, but from the standpoint of what bioregional economies may be more vibrant than many people think already, say in North America. A lot of tribal economies are largely bioregional and have a whole lot of bartering as aspects to them. And there is trade between different regions in locally produced goods and services. And it just strikes me that our agency, becomes less and less the more we go away from county government or city government towards state, towards federal, towards global. And at least if every continent developed its own continental framework for these bioregional economies to provide, the essential goods and services of a dignified life, it's just an easy concept to wrap your hands around. And the best way to make that, I think of it as what will most likely happen, if anything decent likely happens post larger collapse, will be, that kind of a framework, because there won't be the global trade that we have now. And the best way to ensure that something like that emerges is to roll up your sleeves and begin to put it together and paint the portrait and the vision right now. So because bioregional economies focus on more essential goods and services and less of the frivolous things like plastic toys imported from China, then they're already focused in more or less the right direction. So rationing would be a decent fit. And as Stan, I wanted to point out that one of our colleagues, Tom A., who follows the COP process quite closely, thinks that there's a bit more wind in the sail of the fossil fuel non-proliferation effort. And you two might want to follow up offline on that.
Yes.
Joan, you mentioned in a note the fundamental challenge of population and all this. Do you want to say more on that?
Well, is an acceptable answer? No. But it is a fundamental issue. And as I mentioned in my introduction, we're facing the 8 billion threshold, and still, no countries are really addressing the need. I mean, we talk a lot about degrowth, and stabilizing population is almost an acceptable conversation, but not decreasing it. And even by, very choice, ethical, there are a lot of good ways to bring the population down but I think we have to have that conversation out on the table and really be exploring, what in our society is incentivizing people, particularly the wealthy countries where the footprint and the impact is so much greater, to have, so many children. And go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead, Michael.
Go ahead, Stan. Go ahead.
On that subject, Joan, and this larger discussion of collapse and production and so forth, I recommend to all of you a book just published by a couple of months ago by my friends Wes Jackson and Robert Jensen. Inconvenient Apocalypse is the title of it. And it's a kind of a philosophical look at how, assuming, say, that we're going to be eventually a planet of 2 billion people, is there a humane way for that to happen? But
there is some good research for it. And just maybe to to highlight the complexity of that. I mean, we can talk about a lot of, different strategies and approaches, but in the last week, I've had two friends lamenting, heartbroken, tearful, because their children are deciding not to have children. And, there are just many, many things that need to be tackled.
Yeah.
Yes, Jane Monkey from the Food Packaging Forum writes, I think one of the key challenges is that humanity lacks a shared vision of how the future should be, because this will be fundamental for defining what is essential. People have very different ideas about this. Randy, I want to invoke you personally in terms of frugality. When I've run into you in airports from time to time on your ongoing international travels, everybody else has a big carry-on and a big backpack and everything else. And you're wandering around with this little tiny, sort of micro carry-on and nothing else. And it seems to me that somewhere along the line, you decided to practice this. What's it like for you? Are you still doing that? And what's it like for you to live with the level of frugality that you apparently do and that you encourage others to do?
I think it goes back to my hillbilly roots, being from West Virginia, where we just didn't have very much.
Mm-hmm.
So it never felt like a great loss. And even in my couple of decades running the Rainforest Action Network, I never paid myself more than about $62,000 a year for a 80-hour-a-week job, and so just keeping a low overhead lifestyle, it's just been my modus operandi forever. And now it's 72 and a half. It's just less to carry is a good thing. So.
No, but I think,
with international travel and changing planes, I of course have to worry about my carbon budget. So I have to save a rainforest every now and then to justify my existence. But if you don't check your baggage, you just got it kind of under your seat.
Yeah, well,
I can do a 2-week trip in Europe, including suit and tie meetings with what you've seen in that little roller bag.
Well, there you go. It really has a kind of Gandhi-esque dimension to it that, self-imposed ethical, grounds are encouraging toward a rationing point of view. Tom writes, Stan, you have not said anything about how the cap would be allocated. This is a particularly interesting question. When it comes to extraction. The conversation on this is just beginning, including with the fossil treaty discussion. Stan, any comments on that?
Well, if that means how the annual quota that could be extracted, how that would be allocated, that would be these at least the way Larry and I actually differ on that. I believe that nationalization of all of the reserves and infrastructure of fossil fuels will be necessary. That these corporations aren't going to go with a business model that requires them to go out of business within 10 or 20 years. And then there would need, these public cooperatives or whatever they are who take that over. There would need to be some democratic structures of some kind there to guide it. And it's true that is a very complicated thing, but we got into the discussion early in the pandemic of what are essential goods and services, which people have have to go to work no matter what, et cetera. So it would require a lot of the same kind of calculations that the country went through during World War II, when they took automobile factories and converted them, making tanks and so forth. But I don't have an overall answer for that.
Mm-hmm. It's Randy writes, I have a 2-pager on the vision of continental networks of bioregional economies that might contribute to a shared vision. Randy, yeah, if you can share that somehow, that would be really interesting. Well, we're moving toward completion. We're going a bit over the hour because we started with some difficulties for people getting on, and we deeply apologize for that. I am left, Stan, with, first of all, how profoundly important this is, and gratitude to you and Joan and this extraordinary paper that you've done. And as you said, it's like tooth extraction. It's not something people want to think about. But as you've also pointed out, rationing happens all the time, and it happens by price, and it happens in other ways. So we're just talking about more equitable rationing. And then the idea that it could be done in well-organized countries with some level of national control and capacity to do it is clear. And you've described how there could be clubs of more developed and less developed nations that could gradually increase to take in perhaps 80% of consumption in the world, which is a very promising response to the international dimension of this. I'm not sure we've addressed as much the question of the value of authoritarianism, sort of green fascism, if you want, where countries like China is such a good example, who really can enforce rationing, and in fact may be inclined to enforce rationing in order to stay in power in a situation where rationing is essential to keeping the population alive. So it seems to me that the question of totalitarianism or authoritarianism, green fascism, if you will, or green equitable fascism, as one logical outcome of the rationing process is one that we need to address. And I wonder, Stan, since you've thought a lot about this, where do you come out on that?
Well, Michael, I don't really foresee basically benevolent dictators managing to prevail. China has, over time, as they've grown wealthier, the degree of inequality, which was extremely low, before, back in the 70s, 80s, has exploded. Now there's a great deal of inequality, and even though they have managed to, like with the COVID shutdowns and so forth, have demonstrated the power of the government there. It's hard to imagine a government like that has had such great success becoming a world power, deciding to basically undermine its global power by having phasing out the use of fossil fuels and having rationing for equity.
So you don't expect green fascism to prevail. That's the point.
Yep, and least of all in this country, because we're heading in the direction of fascism, and the people leading that are the opposite of green, and so that's part of this series with City Lights that I'm writing about. What are going to be the consequences in this country?
Thank you. Well, I'm going to turn to Randy and then Joan and back to Stan for final comments. This has been an extraordinarily productive and interesting conversation. Randy, your last reflections on the conversation.
Oh, if I could write a $3 million check, I would allocate $1 million a year just to a public relations campaign over the next 3 years to popularize the positive aspects of this approach to deal with the crisis, many of which are well articulated in Stan's paper. So to those who haven't had a chance to read that paper, I really recommend that you do so, as well as his book on rationing. And I'm just very excited to have this discussion today. I can imagine that we could think of more specific follow-up aspects of it down the line. So, Joan?
Well, I would just like to thank all of you for what has been a very provocative and thought and challenging conversation. So thank you, Stan, and thank the guests and thank the comments. So
wonderful. And Stan, your last reflections.
Well, people, when they give talks and so forth, they always say, but what can give us hope? We need to, is there hope, etc. And my kind of not very helpful answer is it all depends on what you're hoping for. If you're hoping for this world that grew out of the fossil fuel bonanza to continue indefinitely into the future, then there's no hope. But if you're hoping for a degrowing world in which the goals are humanitarian, and where to the extent possible that decent living standards can be maintained without destroying nature, then I think there's plenty to do to work toward that.
Thank you. And my final reflections, first of all, just deep gratitude to you, Stan and Joan, for taking us into a profoundly important subject, which we know people don't want to think about. But Stan, your paper is just brilliant on it with its historical references. And I just think even though this is hard for people to think about, we're in a world of things that are hard to think about. And that's what the work of the FAN Initiative and Omega and the Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, that's what we're designed to think about. I happen to have a somewhat different view on the future prospects of ecofascism, because I think if we really look at it, if you look back at the Nazis actually had some green ideas. They had some green ideas. They thought about it. People don't like to remember also that they were into Tibetan Buddhism. So there were a whole series of progressive, from our point of view, tropes in fascism, both ecological and spiritual, that we tend to forget about. And it just seems to me that there will be an increasing interest in enforcing limits to growth, limits to consumption, limits to production, that will come from, quote, well-meaning people who see the need to do this and have the power to enforce it. And I can imagine authoritarian regimes that come into power with the promise to do this equitably and with a vision that this is how they stay in power. So you may be right, Stan, that that won't happen. But my crystal ball says that there may be countries and places where some version of eco-authoritarianism takes a run at it. So I look forward to continuing the conversation, and with deep gratitude to the FAN Initiative, Millennial Alliance for Humanity and the Biosphere, Randy Hayes, Stan Cox. Stanley, back to you.